Hi everyone, welcome to our week 14 content. This week we'll be talking about the concepts of death and dying as well as physician-assisted death. The concept of death is something that can be kind of hard to pin down, kind of hard to understand. There are a lot of different definitions of death depending on the time period and the culture that we're looking at. In the United States, we tend to think in kind of a medical model sort of way where biological death or the irreversible end of all brain activity is considered to be true death, the end all be all definition of death. But there are other definitions as well in the United States and other cultures. We also have a concept called social death, which is where a living person is treated as being dead or non-existent, essentially being shunned by other living people. And this is something that might be more present in other cultures, but we do see this in the United States as well. Both biological and social death can have very massive consequences on the community that a person is a part of, whether they are biologically dead or otherwise. And so the significance of a death and the type of a death to occur can be maybe not quite so black and white, not quite so clear as we might expect. Regardless of the kind of death that's occurring or the context, dying is always going to be a social process. So whenever a person dies, whether it is a biological death, a social death, there's going to be an effect on the other people around them, an effect on their social relationships, an effect on their community. And so as we dive into this topic some more in understanding death from a medical sociology perspective rather than so much a philosophical perspective, we want to think about what does it mean for a person to die? What is death? When is someone dead? And how do we define these concepts as medical practitioners, as sociologists, and as individuals, as participants in our culture? What do these concepts mean? What is the significance of this life event? And how can we understand this in our changing world with these new technologies that are kind of expanding our experiences of the end of life and making things look very different than they used to even a few decades ago? When it comes to the dying process, there is a trajectory leading up to the actual death of a person, particularly looking at biological death in this case. There are different kinds of awareness that a person might have of their impending death. Closed awareness would be where that dying person doesn't recognize that their death is approaching, but other people do. So this might be a person who is, for one reason or another, completely unaware of what is happening. Suspected awareness is where the dying person suspects what others know, and they try to confirm or deny their suspicion. They think that other people know that they might be dying, and they'll try to find out if that is true, if that perception is reality. Mutual pretense refers to where every person, the dying person and those in their life, everyone understands what is happening, but they kind of pretend that the others don't. It's kind of just a, let's not talk about this sort of situation where everyone's aware of what's happening, but it's kind of just not acknowledged. It's not being discussed. Open awareness, on the other hand, is where everyone is aware and everyone acts on the significance of the situation openly. Everyone is aware that death is coming up for that person, that death is approaching for whatever the reason might be, and everyone is kind of going along with that information, adjusting as needed to the situation, and not sweeping it under the rug, really just confronting that reality right then and there. To expand on this a little bit further, we have 4 different dying trajectories which a person may go through in that dying process. This can look very different depending on a lot of circumstantial factors, but first we have certain death at a known time. This is pretty rare. This is where a person knows exactly when they are going to die, that they are going to die, and in some cases they may know how they are going to die as well. So this could be an example of something like physician-assisted death or potentially suicide, where there is certain death at a known time. Secondly, we have certain death at an unknown time. This is where we are absolutely sure that somebody is going to die, probably in the near-ish future, but it's an unknown time exactly. This could be someone who has a terminal diagnosis of some sort where They know that they're going to die. They have an impending death, but they're not sure exactly when that time is going to be. It could be fairly soon, it could be a couple years away. It's kind of nebulous. Third, we have uncertain death, but a known time when certainty will be established. So this is where we're not really sure exactly what is happening as far as when the death might happen, what type of death there might be. This is where a person is not quite sure if potentially their health issues will contribute to death or if they're living with a disability that might contribute to death, but they know they're going to find out soon. They know they're going to find out what exactly is going on. They know that they are dying, but it's just not quite clear when or how. Most people are in camp number 4 here as far as dying trajectories, where it's an uncertain death and an unknown time when those questions will be resolved. So not knowing how exactly you are going to die, when exactly you are going to die, and just having kind of mystery surrounding the whole topic. A lot of the time people will progress backwards from 4, 3, 2 to 1, but it'll kind of depend on the situation, it'll depend on the circumstances, and a lot of these trajectories apply more to individuals who are dealing with chronic illnesses, terminal conditions, or disabilities that in some way could affect their mortality. A lot of people who don't deal with those kinds of situations or realities will be in camp number 4 up until quite likely the very end, especially for anyone who dies from an accident or something that's completely unexpected. So there are a couple different, or 4 different dying trajectories that people may experience, and the psychological impact of being in any of these 4 different trajectories can look very different depending on the individual and the circumstances. There are a lot of different ways that humans deal with facing and processing death, whether it's a death of a loved one, a death of themselves, dealing with your own death. All of this process can look very, very different depending on so many things for individuals and their circumstances. But a few important terms to understand relating to these processes would be first, bereavement. This is the state or the period of mourning after a loved one dies. So if a person has a loved one who passes away, they will enter this state of bereavement or mourning for an undetermined amount of time after that person dies. There are also different stages of coping or stages of grief that you may be familiar with if you've taken psychology classes before. There is some criticism of this idea that we go from denial to anger to bargaining to depression to acceptance. A lot of people will tell you that you don't have to go in a linear fashion through these stages either, that you can go from denial to anger to bargaining to anger to bargaining to anger to bargaining to acceptance. And maybe you skip over depression entirely. And really, all of those different stages of coping, stages of grief, that bereavement process and period, it's going to look so different for every individual person. So this can be a helpful framework to understand that process of facing death and coping and mourning. Um, and this can apply to things beyond death as well. This can be the death of something other than a person, right? The death of a relationship or the end of something important in your life. You can go through those same kinds of stages of grief or even a bereavement period, depending on how important something was to you. Interestingly, from one of our authors this week, they have a statistic that 85% of people think that it's best to make plans surrounding death rather than to ignore the topic. That's a huge proportion of people. That's a lot of individuals, at least in this study, who were surveyed that think it's important to make some kind of plan surrounding death or death care, perhaps hospice care, perhaps burial or cremation, or whatever a person might want done after they passed away. So a lot of people agree that it's important to make those kinds of plans, but a lot of people actually will ignore the topic and not make those plans. They will not deal with processing or facing or dealing with that topic of death or sometimes even tackling the topic when it does happen until it becomes an absolute emergency, right? When someone has already died and now all of a sudden a ton of decisions have to be made. Another important concept is death dips. This is where there is a decrease in mortality, so fewer deaths leading up to significant dates. And this is really interesting. So, leading up to presidential elections or holidays, especially winter holidays when family might be getting together, and also leading up to birthdays, we tend to see a decrease in mortality. A lot fewer people, or let me rephrase here, a lot of people who, especially are older adults or who are dealing with potentially chronic health conditions or terminal health conditions, may, in a sense, hold on to participate in those kinds of holidays. So we see a lot fewer people die right before something like, say, Christmas, as far as we do after. After that holiday has passed, we'll see kind of a rise in the mortality and the rates of death. So we're not entirely sure as researchers why this is happening. We think that it might just be that people want to participate in those things one last time and they can kind of will themselves to get through that social occurrence. And then once that has passed and that holiday is done, that birthday has gone by, then perhaps that is a time that that person may be able to kind of let go and then their death may occur. We also have this concept of broken heart syndrome, which is also called the loss effect. This is where mortality or the likelihood of death increases after the death of a spouse. So if a person is widowed, if they enter widowhood, which is the state of existence where your spouse, your husband, your wife, your spouse, the person you're married to has died, we do see evidence that people often die quite soon after the death of their spouse. Um, this could be due to, of course, that loneliness, that lack of social connection, or just the absolute stress of going through such a traumatic and difficult experience. Um, so it's very interesting. A lot of the time, people who die of this so-called broken heart syndrome didn't necessarily have a lot of health concerns leading up to their death, but another kind of interesting caveat of this loss effect is that quite possibly if a person's spouse dies, they probably had a very similar lifestyle to their spouse if they were with them for a long time or living with them with similar lifestyles. And so sometimes we will see that a person will pass away of similar health problems as their spouse at kind of a similar time. Finally, in our list of concepts here, we have a concept called anticipatory grief. This one again is really interesting. This is where some people may grieve an impending death before it occurs. So if you're in one of those trajectories where there is this awareness that someone is going to die, perhaps it's a loved one, and you know that that death is coming up, you may be able to go through this anticipatory grief process where you can kind of begin grieving before the death actually occurs. If this is something that does not happen, there's nothing wrong with that. If this is something that does happen, that's perfectly fine and perfectly normal as well. And some people in this situation may actually find that once that person does pass away, that they feel like they've kind of gone through those stages of grief. They've kind of gone through their bereavement and their mourning period to an extent already, which is very interesting. Prior to the death, they've kind of done that grieving process. Of course, that doesn't always happen, and it's not a linear process in any case, but definitely a very interesting concept, anticipatory grief. When it comes to the process of preparing for and dealing with a death after it has happened, all of this falls under the umbrella of something we call death care. So this can be that pre-death treatment for somebody who is dying, so something like hospice care. This also includes the treatment of the bodies of individuals who are deceased, and burial practices or religious, spiritual, or cultural celebrations or ceremonies, so things like a celebration of life or a funeral or cremation, all of these kinds of things fall under this category of death care. The interesting thing about death care in our modern capitalist society is that we tend to really outsource these kinds of things to professionals. We're not usually dealing with these kinds of things as individuals very much anymore. And that's not always how it was in the United States or for a lot of human history. For a lot of our history, people would deal with the bodies of their loved ones instead of having, say, funeral directors or hospice care workers do that kind of work. And that's not to say that it's better or worse for us to do it in one way or another, but there are some impacts of the way that our profit-focused system works today that are potentially not so great for the environment and potentially people involved in these processes as well. A lot of the things that we do in the death care industry can be pretty unnecessary and environmentally damaging. So, one great example of this would be embalming a body. There is actually no health reason or legal reason that bodies are required to be embalmed in most cases. Dead bodies are, believe it or not, actually not dangerous unless a person dies of a very contagious disease that can be spread from their body after death. It's actually not really this emergency like we act like it is when a person passes away. Often we rush, immediately to get that person embalmed and to get everything taken care of, perhaps within the week. And this rush to, take care of the body in whatever way the family wishes to do, it might be a little bit misguided in some cases because those chemicals that are used for embalming, not only are they extremely dangerous to the embalmers and the people working in funeral homes, but they're also pretty bad for the environment. They are well-known carcinogens, which means they're cancer-causing chemicals. And when we have a bunch of embalmed bodies buried in cemeteries and that chemical leaks into the groundwater, or that concoction of chemicals, it can actually be very dangerous for the people in the surrounding community, the people who are living off of the groundwater that is shared with the cemetery. And again, it's completely unnecessary to do embalming in almost every case, unless there is some reason that a person's body needs to be shipped internationally or across many state lines. Typically, embalming is something that's done for aesthetic purposes, and it is very expensive. Embalming and cremation and burial and caskets and all of these kinds of things can be very expensive. And so all of these different aspects of death care, they can kind of bleed a person dry. If you're going to go through with some kind of ceremony for a loved one, if you're buying a casket, if you're paying for cremation, um, you really want to hope that you're working with death care industry professionals who are going to not be focused on that profit so much as caring for the body and the process of celebrating your loved one. Um, Another important note on this environmentally damaging kind of point here is that cremation is actually also very bad for the environment. Um, Cremation lets off tons of greenhouse gases. It is very, very heavily polluting, and more and more people are being cremated now than ever before. And people are still doing casket burials as well. And both of these practices, while there are a lot of cultural and spiritual and religious elements tied up in them, and they're very sentimental for a lot of people. A lot of people in the death care industry, a lot of activists are kind of pushing to move towards more green burial practices. So moving away from using these very high polluting, cancer-causing, chemical-ridden kinds of practices, moving towards perhaps some less environmentally damaging, less expensive, and less unnecessary kinds of practices. Another important concept for us to discuss this week is suicide. This is a difficult topic to discuss for a lot of reasons, so please feel free to skip ahead in the lecture if this is something difficult for you to hear about right now. But suicide can be defined as the active or passive choice to end one's own life. There are a lot of reasons why a person might go down this path. Mental health struggles, especially with depression, is a big reason. But a lot of people may go down this path because they've experienced a life-altering event or some kind of traumatic experience, like the end of a relationship, the death of someone close to them, the loss of a job, or something else similar. We also have a concept in sociology called anomie. This comes from Emile Durkheim. This is the state of society where culture or society has this breakdown of norms and conduct. So this is a state where there's just this normlessness within the community or within the space where people are kind of unsure of what they should be doing, how they should be behaving, and what will happen next. The beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic was a really great example of anomie. This is a situation where People were feeling very isolated. They were kind of not sure what was going to come next, what they should be doing, how they should be responding. And a lot of the social norms that people are very used to living by, they kind of became irrelevant and they changed and they shifted and often very quickly. And so, this state of anomie, if our society or culture is in this state of normlessness, that can be actually a catalyst for a lot of people to consider suicide because it's just a very difficult, anxiety provoking kind of situation to be in. Another main reason is low levels of status integration. So, um, in simpler terms, this is where a person is lonely, they're socially isolated, they are not integrated within their community, they maybe don't really have a community, they feel very disconnected from other people. Physical health struggles and disability, and especially chronic pain, can be another big reason that people might go down this path towards suicide. It can be very difficult to deal with physical health struggles and with chronic pain and with disabilities. And a lot of individuals that might be combined with a life-altering event where they go through a traumatic event that ends with a disability, they acquire a disability, and that can be a very, very difficult transition. Finally, we also have this concept called the Werther effect. This is where suicide rates may actually increase society-wide after a highly publicized suicide. So especially if a celebrity or somebody who's very well known or any suicide that gets a lot of media attention, when that happens, we may see kind of copycat suicides, so to speak, where there's an increase in suicide rates amongst the general population, and that would be called the Werther effect. Diving into one specific type of suicide, so to speak, we can discuss physician-assisted death, or PAD. This is where, under specific circumstances, a person who has a fatal or terminal disease can opt to die through the use of doctor-administered medications, which cause biological death. They cause the body's systems to shut down. And so this is a form of suicide, but it is kind of understood differently because it is a very medicalized, very structured, very specific type of death under very specific circumstances. And this comes from the 1980s, the Right to Die movement. This was an activist movement that was led by a lot of chronically ill and disabled individuals, as well as other people and the loved ones of people with disabilities and terminal illnesses. This was basically promoting the idea that people have a right to choose death with dignity, that people who want to, end their suffering, especially from a terminal illness, should have the option to do so on their own terms in a way that is comfortable, maybe a bit faster, and that they can be surrounded by their loved ones when they choose to do so. There are not very many states in the United States where physician-assisted death is legal and available. Colorado is one state where PAD is available, but California, DC, Hawaii, Montana, Maine, New Jersey, New Mexico, Oregon, Vermont, and Washington are the other states where it is available. And in all of these states, the same requirements are typically in place, but some states have their own requirements on top of these as well. But everybody who is eligible for physician-assisted death must be 18 years or older, a resident of the state where they're going to take the medication. They must be determined to be mentally capable. They have to be able to self-administer and ingest medications with no help from any other individuals. And they have to have a terminal diagnosis with a prognosis of 6 months or less to live. So this is very, very specific. And for those reasons, not a lot of people actually go through with physician-assisted death because it is not extremely accessible. There are not a lot of places that it's accessible, but even in the places where it is, there are a lot of reasons why a person might not be able to meet all those requirements or why they might not go through the very difficult process of getting this medication. But up to 2,000 people do use physician-assisted death per state every year. That figure is not set in stone. Sometimes this data is not very well tracked, but potentially about 2,000 people per state where this is allowed. Interestingly, there is a lot of more nuance to this topic than it might seem like on the surface. Physician-assisted death is a very controversial topic for a lot of reasons. And Across the board, people who are taking part in physician-assisted death are going to always be people with terminal illnesses or people who are disabled in a way that is related to their mortality, that they have that 6 months or less to live. One of the reasons why physician-assisted death is so controversial within the disabled community is that this right to die may, for some people, be seen as a duty to die. Disabled people are often seen in a very ableist lens as being a burden, right, or a drain on the economy. And a lot of eugenicist kinds of perspectives are aimed at eliminating people who are so-called burdens or reducing the amount of cost spent on the medical care for individuals with disabilities or terminal conditions. And so there's this concern that the right to die movement and getting physician-assisted death legalized in different places could actually become dangerous for people who are disabled, instead kind of pushing them, pressuring them to utilize physician-assisted death, right? Kind of putting this burden label on those individuals and saying that they should use physician-assisted death because they are so-called drains on the economy or burdens. Of course, this is a very ableist perspective. We would love to hope that that's not something that people are going through, but a lot of people have spoken up, a lot of disabled activists, and they have said that this is something that people are seeing, that this pressure, even if it's not something that is kind of set in stone, it's just an idea, that pressure can be really, really difficult to deal with as a disabled or chronically ill or terminally ill person. The question this really brings up is, why do we have a movement for death with dignity, but not life with dignity for disabled people? How come there is this focus and funding towards physician-assisted death and this kind of resource, instead of focusing more funding towards making life better for people who are living with disabilities or chronic and terminal illnesses? Ideally, we could have all of these things be accessible to everyone who needs and wants them, that life with dignity and death with dignity could both be possible. A couple questions that are interesting to think about that some of our readings bring up this week. Would it decrease physician-assisted death rates if disabled and sick people had free and high-quality treatment available? Right? If we could have that life with dignity where medical care was not an economic burden, where accessing care, even round the clock in-home care, if that were completely accessible and available to everyone, would we see the use of physician-assisted death at those same rates, right? That 2,000 per state kind of rate, or would we see fewer people utilizing this? We also want to think about, why is physician-assisted death only available to terminally ill or disabled people? This is where it gets really controversial again. Do we think that it should be available to just anyone, right? Are those requirements unfair? Are they just? Should people have to be 18 or older? Should they have to have only 6 months or less to live? Should they have to be a resident of the state where they want to take the medication? Why does someone have to have a terminal illness at all? Why can't someone use physician-assisted death just because they are suicidal and depressed, right? Why do we make the rules that we do over these kinds of practices? And there's a lot of thought that goes into these standards. There's a lot of debate that goes into creating the regulations for this kind of thing. And of course, there are a lot of reasons why we want to prevent the unnecessary and preventable deaths of as many people as we possibly can. We want to have that life with dignity for people, have support for people, make sure that people have the resources and the care that they need, and that they get help if they're in a situation where perhaps they are feeling suicidal for reasons outside of a terminal illness. It is interesting to think about, though, why we as a society consider that to be a valid reason to want to die, right? Having a terminal illness, having 6 months or less to live, why is that the one context where this is seen as kind of different? Again, I don't have the answers for you. I think they're just very interesting questions. I want you all to come to your own conclusions about this topic. I'm just here to provide information about kind of what this process looks like, how people can access this kind of resource, and a little bit about the regulations that we currently have in place regarding PAD. So, in summary, really, there are no right answers when it comes to death and dying and suicide and physician assisted death. These are very emotional, very personal, very individual topics. So, the way that a person deals with their death, deals with other people's deaths, the way that someone copes with their illness, and whether they would like or would not like to go after physician assisted death as an option, all of these different factors are very, very individual choices. It's important to, do your research if you're considering any of these kinds of things. If you're looking for, death care for a loved one, if you're looking for hospice care, if you're making end of life plans for yourself or someone else, um, if you're going through any of these processes, if you're dealing with any of these concepts, it is very difficult. There's a lot of information out there, and it is not easy to make these kinds of decisions. It's not easy to deal with these kinds of things. So it's very important to talk to your loved ones, to think with yourself about what you kind of want these things to look like. Um, Death is a very medicalized topic, but it's also a very personal and often for some people spiritual or religious or just extremely emotional. And so the way that everyone deals with and thinks about death is so unique to them. And it's really important to think about these topics so that you can be prepared if you are or if you ever find yourself in these kinds of situations. Thank you all for being here for this week. I know this is not an easy topic to go over. I tried to keep it short this week so that we're not too down in the dumps after this lecture. But as always, feel free to reach out to me with any questions. Thanatology and death studies is one of my main focuses as a researcher. I think this stuff is fascinating. And so I would love to talk to any of you about this topic if you're interested. Thanks.